And now, marine weather around Alaska. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your marine weather outlook for the state of Alaska as we head through the midweek period. First, quick check of the sea ice. It has obviously, we're now near the minimum extent of expected sea ice, and at this point, no new ice is really developing, but that won't be the case for too much longer. Usually we start to see early development of new ice late in September, early October. So minimum ice pretty much climatologically within the ballpark occurring around this time. Looking at the surface weather maps coming up here late tonight, early on Wednesday morning, we have an area of low pressure, atmospheric river, along with stronger winds along this warm front lifting northward up toward the northern Gulf Coast. And a secondary, well, the main low initially, because this is the secondary development, the main low pushing into Bristol Bay and weakening. And by Wednesday afternoon, we have the low situated just off the Kenai coast with this frontal band and stronger gale force winds along this front. And then an emphasis of heavier precipitation as a result of this atmospheric moisture surge that's going to be coming up into the northeast Gulf Coast around Yakutat at first, later on Wednesday, and then drifting southeastward and setting up over the central panhandle for late Wednesday night and especially throughout the day Thursday into Thursday night. And as much as 2 to locally 4 inches of rain could fall with this system from Yakutat down into the central panhandle, which could cause some of the local creeks and smaller rivers to fill to bank full or maybe even some minor flooding. But back further west, we have another low coming into the southwest corner of the Bering Sea. This will be a bit stronger than some of the ones that have impacted the Gulf, in that the central pressure will be down below 980 millibars, and along this frontal system there will be gale force winds and bands of rain. By Thursday, though, the low in the Gulf weakens, pushes up toward just along the panhandle, northern portion of the panhandle coast with the occluded front pushing inland and weakening. This other low back to the southwest, not nearly as significant. And on the backside, we're going to start to see some clearing along areas, at least briefly, along areas of the southwest, especially southwest interior up through the Yukon and Kuskokwim River valleys. Looking at the marine forecast for Wednesday for the inner channels of the panhandle, southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, Stevens Passage up through Lynn Canal, waves 3-4 feet, northwest winds 10 knots, waves as high as 4 or 5 feet there, Dixon Entrance. Look for west-southwest winds 20 to 25 knots south of Sitka and off of Craig, but increasing south winds will then turn more southeast to east to 35-knot gales there west of Gustavus and outside of Yakutat Bay to Cape Suckling. And we expect waves up that way to be building as high as 13 to 18 feet there off of Cape Suckling. On Thursday, though, winds do come down, as will the waves as a result. So we expect southeast winds 15 to 20 knots for the inner channels, waves generally running 3 to 4 feet. Outer coast, south winds 20 to 25 knots south of Sitka and off of Craig, 10 to 11 foot waves. And then as we go up west of Sitka to outside of Yakutat Bay, we're looking at south winds turning more southeasterly there toward Cape Suckling at 15 knots. Waves generally running right around 9 feet. On Wednesday, as that low comes up along just off the Kenai coast, we expect there could be 45-knot gales up here in kind of the northwest corner of the Gulf. So locally, some higher gusts may approach 50 knots outside there of Hinchinbrook Entrance. As for Prince William Sound, 35-knot southeast gale, 7-foot waves. Look for northeast to north winds anywhere from 20 to 25 knots along the length of Cook Inlet, with waves as high as 5 to 7 feet, especially there at the entrance of Cook Inlet. But Thursday, winds come down considerably, only around 10 knots and variable from Prince William Sound to off the Kenai coast. Winds will generally be north-northwest across the, or I should say the upper middle Cook Inlet. Look for north winds around 10 to 15 knots, waves 3 feet, but winds coming out of Kamishek Bay and the entrance of Cook Inlet northwest 25 knots with waves around 5 feet. For Wednesday, Kodiak Island will see southwest winds offshore 25 knots, waves 8 feet. Shelikof Strait 15-knot southeast winds with 4-foot waves. And as we go down the length of the Alaska Peninsula, look for southwest to west winds 20 knots, shifting northwest to 20 knots either side there at Cold Bay and False Pass, with waves running generally in the 5 to 6 foot range. And for Thursday, across a broad area of the region, northwest winds right around 20-25 knots, at least for the middle upper portion of the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, with waves of 4 to 6 feet on the Bering side. Northwest winds turning more westerly north of Cold Bay, and waves generally running 6-7 feet there. The eastern Aleutians on Wednesday will see northwesterly winds to 30 knots with waves 7 to as high as 12 feet on the North Pacific side, around 14-15 feet on the Bering side. Those northwest winds go back more toward the west as you get west of Adak at 25 knots, and then shift southerly to 40-knot gales, Kiska westward to Shimia, because there's that other stronger low entering the southwest corner of the Bering Sea, with the frontal system extending south from there. And for Thursday, that front pushes east through the central Aleutians. Ahead of it, look for south-southwest winds to 30 knots there, Nikolsky through Unalaska. But behind the front, winds go southwesterly as high as 35 knots across the central Aleutians, especially between Atka and Adak, with waves there 7 to 10 feet. And along the southwest coast, we expect winds to be 20 knots, northerly winds out of Bristol Bay, and 25-knot north winds out of Kuskokwim Bay, 35-knot gales, north gales in the Pribilov Islands, with waves running 12-13 feet, and then off the lower Yukon, 30-knot north winds with waves there running 5-6 feet. Winds come down across the region, except towards St. Matthew by Thursday. Winds west 20 knots within Kuskokwim Bay, northwest winds 20 knots within Bristol Bay, waves 3 to 4 feet there. A little bit more of a mixed bag of winds off the lower Yukon Delta, Norton Sound, north-northwest winds at 10 to 15 knots, but 35-knot southeast gales in the vicinity of St. Matthew, with waves as high as 10 to 11 feet. For Wednesday, through the Bering Strait, north side of St. Lawrence, 30-knot north winds, waves 7 to 8 feet. Those winds trail off north-northeasterly at 15 knots along the northwest Arctic coast and up toward middle Chukchi Sea. Waves 3 to 5 feet there. And then look for winds west-southwest 10 knots, Prudhoe Bay eastward toward Kaktovik, with waves of 3 feet. For Thursday, west-northwest winds 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coast, Utqiagvik to Kaktovik, waves 4 or 5 feet. And kind of a mix off of Point Lay, onshore, offshore, 10 knots. But once you get down through the lower Chukchi Sea, look for north winds at north to northwest winds, 15 knots coming in there towards Shishmaref. And then through the Bering Strait, north winds there around 10 knots with 3-foot waves off of Port Clarence, and south winds up toward Gamble at 10 knots and waves of 3 feet.